while all our attention is fixated on Washington, D.C., the federal government, and the insane dramas and chaos surrounding the presidency of Donald J. Trump, we forget that out there across this great land of ours, we continue to have a massive billionaire-funded right-wing attack on the very institutions that we respect and love. Now, last week, we had Mary Bottari from the Center for Media Democracy on the program, talking about the trove of documents they have received relating to the Bradley Foundation, which is a right-wing billionaire-funded foundation that is working very hard to create an infrastructure for the political right around the country, creating think tanks at the state level and promoting politicians of the far right at the state level and so on. And when you do that, you're really taking over, among other things, the state houses. So you're redrawing congressional districts and controlling the federal government as well. So that is the battleground, especially as we roll into the 2020 census, where the lines will be drawn again. And by the way, here in Washington, D.C., the Republicans are underfunding the Census Bureau to make sure that minorities and low-income people and other communities that might not vote the way they want are undercounted, which is also a way of rigging the game in their own benefit, because Republicans are cheaters. But let's go back to the Bradley Foundation for a second, because I do want to talk about that a little bit more. I do some work. I do with the Center for Media and Democracy. I've been reviewing that document trove myself, and I wrote a piece for them this week on their funding of a extreme, very out there researcher, sociologist, who believes some crazy things. And I wrote it up in a piece called The Bradley Foundation's Secret War on Gay Marriage and Liberal Sex. And the reason why I called it that is because this researcher, whose name is Mark Regnerus, is at the University of Texas in Austin. He has some very, very strange ideas and has done some very unscientific research in order to, shall we say, give more pseudo-proof to the biases of the cultural right. He's most famous is the right word, for publishing a study which seemed to suggest, at least he argued that it suggested, that children raised in same-sex marriages didn't do as well. That what he called unconventional families, that these resulted in poor outcomes for children. However, more than 200 sociologists and psychologists and other experts signed a letter challenging both, quote unquote, the intellectual integrity and the methodology of his reports. Now, what he did was he purportedly surveyed children who grew up in homes where the parents were of the same sex, were biologically unrelated to the child, were unmarried or cohabiting, or where the biological mother was either, quote, single or had a romantic relationship with another man, meaning not the father. In other words, Regnerus studied anybody who social conservatives wouldn't like, any family that doesn't meet their highly rigid interpretation of what a family is. Now, he concluded report has been used to argue that children are harmed by being raised in same-sex couples, but as the 200 people who signed a letter condemning it noted, he really studied very, very few same-sex couples. His methodology was terrible, and there were serious questions about his integrity as a researcher. Nevertheless, right-wingers continue to quote his studies over and over, but Regnerus wasn't content just to attack same-sex marriages. For example, he wrote at one point that liberal, and he used the word liberal, and quote-unquote very liberal women crave sex more than more conservative women do. Now, his reason for concluding that was based on, what I would argue is this rather spotty or sketchy survey that he did of women, but he then went further, and he said that the reason why liberal and very liberal women crave so much sex, according to him, is because they don't go to church. His conclusion was because they don't go to church, they don't have a transcendent experience in their lives, so they make up for the lack of transcendence by craving sex. Now, there is, however, first of all, if you've been to, unless you're talking about a Pentecostal or evangelical church, I would argue that many conservative churches don't offer much of a transcendental experience. But that aside, there's another simpler explanation for his survey result. Maybe, just maybe, liberal women are less reluctant to admit that they have sexual feelings at all. So when you ask women, do they ever desire sex, it could just be that liberal women don't share that shame that is so endemic on the right, especially of female sexuality. That would be my theory, but no, he thinks it's because they don't go to church. But that's not the only crazy idea that the Bradley Foundation researcher has. He also believes that the reason why straight men have become more tolerant of same-sex marriage is because they watch porn. And therefore, by watching porn, they become more amenable to non-traditional forms of sexual interaction. Now, I can't emphasize to you enough just how nutty this kind of thinking is and the absolute lack of scientific validation that all of these experiences, or all of these opinions have. So it should be noted that the Bradley Foundation, in funding Mark Regner, is funding somebody who will put a pseudo-academic gloss on the nutty ideas that they hold anyway. Now, this would just be a bunch of rich people wasting their money on a crank if it weren't for the fact that this research is being used in amicus briefs and other court filings to justify attempts to codify and preserve legal bigotry against gender and sexual minorities in this country. That is not wacky, that is despicable. That is using billionaire funding to promote prejudice against a minority in this country, and it's wrong.